It was easy to scapegoat the Asian because we look different.
People who had basically PhD and master's degrees who were forced to be waiters and cooks.
My friends are scared.
And she said, "What are you looking at, Asian bitch?" and spat on.
We did not learn that we were lynched the same way that other communities were lynched.
We just feel it's really important to tackle white supremacy.
Fight for our rights. I mean, we're Asian Americans. I'm born and raised here. I've been dealing with this for decades. It's not just prominent now. It's been a problem for the longest time. So it's time we speak up.
Hey folks, this is Phil, and I need you to click subscribe, click like, and leave me a comment. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the video. Thanks for tuning into Unfiltered with Phil Rosenberg. Tonight, we have a story for you that has been hanging in the newsosphere for quite a long time, and something that hasn't gone away and won't go away, something that must be addressed. Anti-Asian discrimination, particularly the spate of violence that has taken place recently. What is going on? Why is it happening? And how do we fix it? Stay tuned. I'm just curious, what got you motivated in the first place?
I'm the fourth generation of my family in the United States. And so by birth, I am a US citizen. My children and grandchildren are fifth and sixth generation Chinese Americans. And throughout my life, I have heard the stories about the kinds of experiences my great-grandfather had, my grandfather had, and of course, my father himself. By virtue of their exclusion from being able to become US citizens and to be able to take full participation in the US, I began to understand that I was not considered American.
There weren't that many job openings as there are now, for instance. Now, for Chinese or Chinese American or any other Asian American, you could enter almost any field. Back in the 60s, if anything goes wrong with your life or your career, you're destined to go back to running a restaurant or a laundry.
When there's an issue, it's built upon the system. There is a lot of things contributing to that issue, and we need to really dive in and investigate what contributed to this.
But I feel just by being an Asian American man, that I do have a responsibility to represent, the community at large. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, and of course, the Asian American community is quite diverse. We can say the Asian American Pacific Islander community is quite diverse, but I do feel personal responsibility to push back against stereotypes, to speak out when there is racism, as I see it.
I think it's important to take care of our community members. We have to do anything that we can, no matter who we are, to ensure that people feel safe. It's something different when you're told that, when you really build a bond with the group of players, the group of guys who you're told in the locker room is supposed to have your back. No matter what, you're willing to sacrifice your body for theirs, and to take a puck to the chest, to block shots for the team. But then sometimes in the locker room, you'll hear slurs being thrown around that are directed at me and more generally at members who share my descent of being an Asian American. The unfortunate part of that is I felt so strongly that I wanted to be seen as an American during that time. And then I ended up playing for Team Beijing for 2 years for ice hockey. It was actually, all of a sudden, I was all the American I had always wanted to be and none of the Chinese. And I think for a lot of Asian Americans, about recognizing that we do stand in a place that is between Asian and American. We are that bridge.
I can ask you today, do you feel comfortable walking down the street? Do you feel safe? And also, if you can pull out a couple of examples, whatever stands out to you as the most perception altering or notable, for whatever reason you feel it was notable.
Speaking in terms of this time during the pandemic, there was a sense of scapegoating that started happening. The racist attacks and micro moments started happening that turned macro. I myself, and I know a lot of my peers in general as well, were actually in fear of going outside. And I remember one time in specific, I had gone outside for a couple weeks and left my apartment. And finally, this was like in May or something, I was going to go to the store, and I put my mask on and go halfway down the block, I just kind of glanced over at this woman and she said, "What are you looking at, Asian bitch?" And I was like, that had never happened to me before, like right in my neighborhood. And right away, I felt this kind of sense of kind of fear and being othered and, you know, all those kind of feelings that you go through when somebody verbally attacks you.
What are those feelings that you go through when someone attacks you in that way?
Well, you have to sort of assess like who this person is, if they seem mentally stable, and whether to engage them or not. And usually we're sort of taught to sort of ignore these kind of situations, right? But there have been times, you know, I think when I have been verbally harassed, why I will speak up, but it's definitely stays with you.
Our issue is that I was raised to be very non-confrontational. If something happens, we are always told just ignore it. It's not our place. My friend actually got verbally assaulted in Soho yesterday. Someone called her a chink, and the first thing she said to me was she wouldn't even know what to do if she was attacked.
Right now, every single time I walk on the street, I have to stay very much alerted.
Every other week, I'm reminded that I don't belong here when I'm born and raised here.
How are you reminded? In what way?
Every other week, after meeting someone new for 2 minutes, where are you from? You speak so well. You know, just things like that. You always have to justify why I belong here, why I'm born and raised here.
Growing up, you know, there's always so many jokes about Asians eating dogs and that we have chink eyes. So I did grow up with a lot of discrimination where they would discriminate my culture.
Give me an example of the discrimination.
What I eat, food that I eat
Like
are
what?
just anything. Basically anything that has like soy sauce, noodles that look foreign. I would get discriminated for that. I would get discriminated for my color of my skin,
Have you
being
ever been a
called
victim
yellow.
of violence, or you're...
Not violence particularly. No
God.
one laid a hand, thankfully,
Thank God, yeah.
but just all verbal abuse from the community.
Everybody like would just start screaming coronavirus to any of us when we walk past.
A lot of my friends who are members of the API community are scared. A lot of my female friends in particular, especially when they're walking around by themselves. You know, we see in the news nowadays a lot of unfortunate incidents of hate being committed against members of the API community. I think Stop API Hate had found that about 70% of reported attacks had been against Asian American women. I know a lot of folks are very scared that they might end up being the next person who shows up on the news.
So you're undoubtedly familiar with all of the stereotypes associated with Asian Americans. If they haven't been directed at you, you've at least overheard talk of the same. One of the most persistent in the Eastern Asian community is that of the model minority. When I say Eastern Asian, I mean north and east of the Himalayas, right?
Yep.
So I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about what a model minority is and how you relate or don't relate to that stereotype.
So the model minority myth is this idea that Asian Americans don't cause a lot of trouble, that they are high achieving, that and there's something that other minorities should look up to and try to emulate, right? It's in the name, the model minority. Now, the reason why I think this myth is so dangerous for Asian Americans and folks who look like myself is that it sets this impossible standard. And it actually belittles a lot of the issues that Asian Americans face, both in terms of discrimination and in terms of, well, let me point to some real world examples. I think a lot of folks have heard about what happened in Atlanta, Georgia, just a few weeks ago, over at some spas where 6 Asian American women were killed. And I think about, they aren't those high achieving Asian Americans that are stereotyped. They're not out with fancy handbags and lots of money driving fancy cars. You know, they're out there working and fighting for their piece of the American dream. And when we begin to place the model minority myth upon folks like that, we take away education opportunities, we take away financing opportunities. That's incredibly dangerous.
The model minority myth is that Asians are considered closer, not really as, I guess, marginalized possibly as other people of color. and that they're industrious, studious, as you said, might be more quiet and docile, follow the rules, and do well academically, or in maybe like a higher margin of income.
It's another term used as a way to quell and to keep Asian Americans under some kind of myth, which I actually see it as a tool of, white supremacy to keep Asians, in a well-behaved place.
How do we move forward and make changes in our society so that naked racism and violence can become, the past? One thing we know about racism is that it tends to pass from generation to generation, not genetically, but via having been taught, right? A parent teaches a child to have that attitude, or a community teaches its children. I know this is not easy, and maybe to a certain degree, it has to do with human psychology and not relationships between like white people and black people and Asian people. I don't know, but I want to leave the whole floor open to you and tell me, what are your thoughts? What's the best way forward here?
My thought is that, again, that inclusive education will make all the difference. It may not have major impact today, but it will have impact with respect to our future. When our children understand that they have had the same human experience and that they share a tremendous amount in common, that's what's going to make that change.
History has told us that this situation is somewhat endemic inside American society. And just like Thousand Journeys begins with a first step, it has to begin sort of one-on-one. And where there are 15 million Asians out there, I encourage every single one of them to talk to their friends, colleagues, even their own relatives about how to deal with this. And just by that dialogue causes people to think and not look at, oh my goodness, look at that stabbing, look at that mugging. It's a shame what happened to those women in Atlanta. That's not enough. It's how do we help?
We should feel protected at university. We should feel safe in the physical sense. We should also feel safe as citizens, right? That's one of the things that is granted to us as a very fundamental value, I believe.
Thanks so much for listening to the show. It's been a pleasure having you on board. Tune in next time.